guys, it's Casey, and today we're going to talk about my favorite books that I read in 2020. So I read a ton of books that I really liked in 2020. 2020 I feel like was the year where I really figured out what kinds of things I like to read, and then once I kind of figured out what kinds of things I like and what I don't like, I really kind of zeroed in on it. And because there was a ton of great stuff out there that I hadn't read before, I was picking up stuff that I was pretty much guaranteed to like. So I read a ton of books that I rated 4 and 5 stars this year. All that being said, that means this list was kind of hard to narrow down. I went through everything I read throughout the year and I struggled to come up with a solid top 10. But I managed to pare it down to 10 books that I think are my favorites of the year. So on this list, if there is a series that I really enjoyed, the series is only allowed to take up one slot, but I will say what my favorite book in that series was. So these aren't in a super strict order or anything, it's kind of just like a general feel of like going towards my most favorite book of the year, but it's kind of a mess. But because I've already babbled enough, let's go ahead and start with the first book, and that is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. So this is a book that everyone read pretty much right when it came out, but because I wasn't super big into reading at the time, it kind of missed me. This is a young adult contemporary about a girl named Star who witnesses her friend be murdered by a police officer while he's unarmed. This book was incredibly written. I cried multiple times. The topics it discusses, I think, were amazingly well done, and I think it was very appropriate for a young adult and an adult audience. While this is a young adult book, I think adults should read this and could get a lot out of it. As much as I wish it weren't, it was super relevant this year, and this book was just incredible, and I know this was on everyone's favorite list the year it came out, and for good reason. Angie Thomas is an incredible writer, and I felt so much for these characters. It was such a good book. And generally, contemporary is not my favorite thing. I think there's only 2 on this list that are contemporary and the rest are fantasy or sci-fi. So for a contemporary to get 5 stars for me and for me to really, really love it as much as I did this one, it really has to do something special. It has to make me feel a lot, and this one absolutely did. So if you're like me and you somehow haven't read this one already, I absolutely recommend that you do. Next we have The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. So I read this back in the beginning of the year. So The Night Circus is about these 2 magicians who are kind of working in a circus to make these attractions that are very magical and whimsical, and they kind of are working to outdo each other. And it's all about this magical circus that kind of comes in the middle of the night and then disappears. And it ends up being this just extremely whimsical story about this circus and magic and a love story between the 2 magicians. And it was so beautiful. I've seen people criticize this book for not being so into the plot or didn't believe the romance, and I think all of that is extremely fair. I loved this book because the writing was beautiful. The writing felt so lyrical and so incredible. I just absolutely adored it. And the atmosphere of this book was so strong. Every time I sat down to read this, I felt like I was transported to this circus, and I really felt so much wonder at the atmosphere all around this circus. This was like reading a feeling. Like this was like reading a very specific vibe the entire time that I was reading it, and every time I revisited it, I was pulled back into that, and I adored it. So next up we have Less by Andrew Sean Greer, and this is the only other contemporary on this list. Less is an adult contemporary literary fiction book about a middle-aged gay man named Arthur Less who gets an invitation to his ex-boyfriend's wedding, and in doing so decides he needs to reevaluate his priorities and kind of find himself, and he decides to take every opportunity that's kind of laying on his desk. So he takes a bunch of different business opportunities and travel opportunities and decides to travel the world over the course of this year. And this follows him as he goes to all of these different countries and meets all these new people and really begins to understand himself and what he wants out of life and what love and relationships mean and are to him. And I thought this book was beautiful. I really feel like this is one of those books that I read it this year and I got one thing out of it, and if I read it again a couple years down the line, I think I'm gonna get something else out of it. This is one that a friend loaned me and then I got my own copy of because I loved it so much, and I just wanted to tab it out, so I need to reread this. It was such an interesting exploration of like love and aging and what it means, and ooh, it was so good. If that kind of thing is something you like at all, I would recommend picking this up. I truly enjoyed it. I don't know why I keep saying I really enjoyed these books, like obviously that's why they're on this list. Next is a more recent one, and there's a couple of more recent ones on this list, and I don't know if that's recency bias or if the end of the year just really knocked it out of the park for me, but oh well. But that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I loved this. This is V.E. Schwab's newest book, and it came out towards the end of this year. And it is about a girl named Addie LaRue who makes a deal with a devil figure, essentially, to live forever. The catch is that no one will ever remember her and she can't leave a permanent mark on the world. So essentially every time that she gets out of line of sight of someone, they turn around and they no longer remember her name. So this follows Addie LaRue all the way from France in like the 1700s to 2014, which is the current day. And the plot that this book focuses on is one day she's at a bookstore and somebody remembers her name. And it ends up being this beautiful love story, and it's also really sad and haunting and beautiful. This book also has incredibly lyrical writing. It felt like poetry in some places. There were poems in this in some places. It was absolutely incredible. And it really did an incredible job of exploring like what it means to be alive and what's important and how we leave our mark on the world and how we affect other people. And overall, I think I've described it as just hauntingly beautiful. It was incredible and I very much loved it. I was a little skeptical going into this just because this book was so hyped up that I thought it couldn't possibly live up to the hype. But after reading this, I was like, yeah, no, that's probably one of my favorite books that I've read this entire year. The writing was amazing. It really had such a strong feeling and vibe and atmosphere, and it was just not fast paced, but like I wanted to keep reading and I needed to know what happened, and I wanted to explore Addie's life with her, and it was just beautiful, and I cried, and I love it. A lot of these books are sad. Sidetracked. Next up, we have The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. So this is a series that I started and finished this year. So I think my favorite of the series is The Poppy War, so that's the one I'm gonna go ahead and hold up. But all three of the books in this series were so good. So The Poppy War is a grimdark fantasy series based on Chinese history that follows our main character Rin as she is working on training to go to a prestigious military academy and then eventually kind of off to war. And this book does not shy away from graphic, disturbing details and descriptions, so please be warned of that before going into this. But if you think that those are things that you can handle, I would absolutely recommend that you check this out. This book sets out to do a very specific thing and it accomplishes it so well. It really is an incredible exploration of war and the effects that it has on people, while also maintaining a very interesting fantasy atmosphere with gods and shaman magic and just some incredible stuff going on. And it also has some really morally gray characters. All of the characters were so well written and their motivations were believable, and I really understood where all of them were coming from. A lot of them I didn't like, right? Like I felt like they were very bad people, and that includes our main character Rin. Like I was not a big fan of Rin for a lot of it, and Rin makes some choices that are really rough and hard to read about sometimes, and it really explores the consequences of those. But this series was just amazing. This series did something that I hadn't really seen before in an adult fantasy book, and the end of the series destroyed me, but this was still probably my favorite one. So but yeah, this series was just so good. Okay, so next we have a book that I really struggled to figure out where to put it on this list, but I felt like it needed to be here somewhere, so I put it smack dab in the middle, and that is Changes by Jim Butcher. So Changes is going to stand in for the Dresden Files as a whole, and Changes is the most recent and my favorite one that I've read probably, with honorable mentions going to Turncoat and Blood Rights. The Dresden Files is a series that I started in the middle of this year, and I'm now on book 13. So I felt very strange filming this video and not putting it on there, because there are several books in this series that I gave 5 stars and I loved, and obviously I loved it enough to read 13 books in 6 months. Like, it's so good. That being said, I've had a lot of ups and downs with this series. So the Dresden Files is an urban fantasy about a wizard for hire named Harry Dresden, who works as a private investigator with the Chicago Police Department to solve crimes that look like they may have been perpetrated by some sort of supernatural being or have some sort of supernatural twist to it. And this series is really well done, but the beginning is a little bit rough at times. There are definitely ups and downs in this, and I think I was maybe a little bit too nice to some of the earlier books, and I hate to be the person who's like, read 6 books before you decide if you like a series, but I really do think that book 6 is where it definitely turned around for me at Blood Rights. But Changes was my favorite one because this one really felt like where everything started to tie together. While things have been kind of woven in throughout the entire first section of the series, this one really felt like the end of kind of an era. It tied in stuff from as early as the first book, and it answered a ton of questions and expanded the world so dramatically, and it changed the stakes and it changed the game of what we were doing, and it was just like mind-blowingly good. I absolutely adored Changes. And for that reason, and for my overall love of the Dresden Files and how excited I get to pick up the next one, it has to earn a spot on here, so that's where we put it. So next up we have The Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson. So this one is standing in for the Mistborn trilogy as a whole, but I think The Hero of Ages was my favorite one. So I actually just finished this one recently, but I adored the entire Mistborn trilogy. So the premise of the Mistborn trilogy is essentially what if the Dark Lord had won, and it's set in this world that is plagued by ashfalls and these very thick magical mists and monsters and things like that. And there's magic that is based on metals. So each metal has a specific thing that it can do, and if you're able to use a metal, you're a mistling, and if you can use all of the metals, you're what's considered mistborn. And our first book follows our main character Vin, who joins up with this sort of ragtag group of thieves who are deciding to overthrow the final empire. And this is another series that has been incredibly hyped up, and I was a little bit nervous about it going in. But after reading the first book, I was like, okay, no, I get the hype. It was so good. I couldn't put it down at all. I got the physical book and the audiobook, and anytime I couldn't physically be holding the book, I was listening to it. I loved it so much. The second book was a little bit slow for me, but I still really enjoyed it. And then this third book happened. And then this happened. Who said this could happen? Ugh. I haven't even read that much Brandon Sanderson, but every time I read a book of his, he sticks the landing. Like, oh my god. While I'm a sucker for a group of thieves, and I adored the first book for that heist aspect of it, this book elevated the entire series like retroactively. The ending of this series made the entire series and the entire build-up better for it. It was an incredible ending, and I absolutely adored it. I love so many of the characters. The magic system is so well fleshed out. The world building is incredible, and everything ties together beautifully at the end of this series, and it was just, it was magical. I adored it. For the most part, it's super fast-paced. There's great characters, great action. It was amazing, and if you like adult fantasy, or even if you like young adult fantasy, I would read this. And sticking with Brandon Sanderson, we have my next book, which is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. This book, oh my god, I can't even. I'm gonna be honest with you, it's really hard for me to describe the plot of this book because it is so huge and expansive, but it is a multi-perspective, high epic fantasy. The Way of Kings is the first book in the Stormlight Archive, and it's the only one that I've read so far, but I'm hoping to fix that very soon. So this is set in Rorschach, which is a world that has been plagued by various wars for a long time, and we follow 4 perspectives, one of which is a surgeon turned soldier, another is a daughter of a noble family who is pretending to try to become a scholar while in reality trying to be a thief. We also follow a prince who has visions of the past, and finally we follow an assassin who cries when he kills, and this book was so good. So I obviously love fantasy, and this is like the quintessential example of an incredible fantasy novel. This took the multi-perspective, huge scope, huge world, lots of characters, lots of countries, things like that you have to know, and it knocked it out of the park. This is the best example of like a high epic fantasy book that I've ever read. I adored this so much. The writing style wasn't too difficult. For being as big as this book is, it's over 1,000 pages. I never felt like it was difficult to read. It wasn't super dense, it wasn't hard to get through, but at the same time it never felt too simple. And similarly to Mistborn, the characters in this were so well written. I felt like I really understood every single character, and I loved them, and I loved figuring out how they all worked in this large theater, and it was absolutely incredible. And I know we're up to 4 books out of what is a planned 10 for this series, and I absolutely cannot wait to pick up the next one. Okay, so we're at the top 2, and next we have The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. So this is a low fantasy book about a man named Linus who works for essentially a social service organization for the care of magical children. So his job is to go and inspect orphanages for magical children and to make sure that they are fit to continue running. And he's kind of just going about his everyday life, not really being very happy, but not sad either, just very neutral and just kind of plugging along every day. One day he's asked to go investigate this very special house that's supposed to house these slightly dangerous children. And when he gets there, he meets this wonderful group of children who are very odd and eccentric, but very loving, and he meets the caretaker, Arthur, and there's a romance there, and it's absolutely so beautiful. This is the most wholesome, beautiful book I have read this entire year. Like, do yourself a favor and read this book. This book really focuses on found family and love and happiness and how to make your own happiness in the world, and it talks about others' perceptions of ourselves, and it was just so good and so cute. I cried out of happiness. I loved this book. It surprised me how much I loved this. I knew this was getting a lot of really good reviews, but I didn't expect to finish it and wonder if this was my new favorite book of the entire year. Like, it was so good. And like, truly, like, self-care, read this book. It was beautiful, it was wonderful. Everyone should read it. It was amazing, just so good. And finally, in the #1 spot, we have my favorite book of 2020, which is The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. So I've talked about this book a ton before, so I don't think anyone was shocked to find out that this was #1. But this is a science fiction book about a girl named Rosemary Harper who joins the crew of the Wayfarer. And the Wayfarer is what is known as a tunneling ship. So they essentially tunnel through and make wormholes. One day the Wayfarer gets a job that is dangerous but pays enough to set them up for life. But it requires them to fly to a area of space that was previously war-torn but is being kind of brought into the galactic fold, and then create a wormhole from there to sort of more of galactic civilization. And this follows this wonderful, amazing, diverse cast of characters, this crew, as they're on this long journey. And it kind of is just like snippets of their everyday life as they're going there. And this book was so good. I love character-driven books, and this really was an exploration of that. Every alien race had its own culture and distinct personality, and it was history, and it was so good and so well done. And I loved everyone on this crew. I loved all of their interactions. This is another book that really focuses heavily on found family and finding yourself and what it means to trust other people and love other people, and it was so good. Some of my favorite characters that I read all year in this book. I think about this book all the time. This book is almost my perfect book. It has an incredible sci-fi setting with rich cultures and alien races set up and rich politics, while also just zooming in on a couple of people's lives and exploring themes like gender, sexuality, identity, morality. It is just so good. And this book is probably my new favorite book of just all time, and it's the first book in a series, and I haven't actually read the other two in the series because I'm trash. Honestly, because I'm so intimidated because I love this one so much, moving on makes me kind of nervous. But this book was absolutely amazing, and if you like character-driven books or science fiction, or specifically character-driven science fiction, read this book. It is my favorite book of 2020. So alright, so those were my top 10 books of 2020. If you've read any of these, let me know and we can talk down below, because again, I love all of these books. Also, let me know what some of your favorite books that you've read this year are. I really love to get recommendations from other people's favorites of the year list. But I think that's all I've got for you guys today. If you want to keep up with what I'm reading, I have a link to my Goodreads in the description down below. But other than that, I'll see you guys next time.